Trump's Venezuela coup. Now, there's a word you don't think you're going to hear very often coming from the United States. We seem to want to avoid that. But no, I think that when you look at what's going on, I think that's probably the most technically accurate term. We have taken and deposed the legally elected government, or at least the person who was sitting there. Let's not get too carried away with that. There's a lot of questions about whether he was legally elected, but that doesn't matter. For international purposes, he was the leader of the country, and we took him out by force, killing about 40 people in the process. So by any definition, that is a coup. And then now, what is the ramifications of this? What comes next? What is all this going to mean? And I think there's been far too little focus on what comes next and what is the ramifications of this for American policy. And we have back with us today for the first time in a while, my former colleague, Rajan Menon, who is a professor emeritus of international relations at City College of New York and a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and a great guy. Raj, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Danny, and Happy New Year to you.
Well, thank you, and the same to you. And as I often say here, I wish it had been under different circumstances. We may just have you on one day just to have a fun conversation and just see where that goes. That might be less stressful.
Here's hoping. Here's hoping.
Let's do that. And as you say, I think bourbon is your drink of choice, is it not? I mean, that am I thinking right?
I'll drink anything with you, my friend.
We may do that. That may be an elixir that would help. And in fact, given the things we have today, we might want to pause and go get some now, but we'll continue on in the meantime. You have written a piece here in The Guardian, published yesterday. After Trump's illegal Venezuelan coup, there are two dangers. He is emboldened, but has no clue what comes next. I'm curious, just kind of off the top, what led you to use the word coup, which you haven't heard many other people use?
Right. I'd like to take credit for the article, Danny, but as you know, editors get to pick it, so it wasn't my pick. But it is, in a sense, a coup, because what we did was to intervene in a sovereign state militarily, launch an operation that was very efficient from the military standpoint, but killed, now the number they say of people who've been killed, including Cubans, is 80. Grab up the president. Let's leave aside, for example, for the moment now, whether he was a good president or not, and spirit him back to the United States. So, we have pulled off a coup in the sense the guy who is the president is no longer the president. That's pretty much a definition of a coup. And if it's done by military force, all the more so.
Yeah, and so that's definitely, all those things are really problematic, and we're going to discuss some of the details of those while we have you here. But I want to start off with something that just happened a couple of hours ago at the United Nations Security Council. The UN the UN ambassador for the United States, Mike Waltz, went on there and gave a forceful defense of this, because a lot of people were, there was a meeting at the UN Security Council today where a number of speakers took to the lectern to give their concerns about this. But far from apologizing, Mike Waltz was pretty emphatic that maybe more is coming. Watch his defense of the Western Hemisphere.
As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela.
So let's take that in bits and pieces. First of all, let's start off with the presumption that this is our hemisphere and we get to call the shots and we get to decide who is good, who is bad, and who is an adversary and who is not. What do you make of that?
Well, as you know, Danny, having read the document yourself, this comes right out of the new national security strategy. Before it was written, you'll recall there was a big discussion about what the emphasis would be in the document on what is U.S. strategy, what areas matter, what issues matter, what areas don't, what issues don't. And lo and behold, the people who expected that the focus would be on China, just called a peer competitor, the only country that can rival the United States, the only country that wants to overtake the United States. That was not what got prime time. The language on China is pretty mild. The focus was on the Western Hemisphere, and it is clearly stated that this is an area in which the United States will remain absolutely dominant and that it will be doing a resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine, but beyond that, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So, what has happened here is surprising in the sense that we didn't expect to wake up in the morning and find out that American forces had spirited Maduro out of the country, but it's not surprising given what they have said is the strategy of the United States under the Trump administration's watch. And there's more to come. We can talk about this.
Yes, there really is. But I want to stick, first of all, in this because I want to get to some of the justification of this. Someone who's, in the business of being a professor and teaching a lot of history and international relations theory, et cetera. Let's look at, first of all, in the legality of this from the United States point of view. And one of the biggest claims, which the ambassador mentioned right there, was that, well, Maduro's a really bad guy, and he was allowing all these bad things to happen here. Is Maduro a bad guy? Is he a good guy? And does that justify spiriting him away, as you said?
Okay, let's begin with the legality part that you brought up first. So if you read the UN Charter, there are clear provisions for when countries can use armed force. It is largely when they are under attack themselves. Some people interpret international law a little bit more widely to say when there's a clear and present danger of an attack. Neither existed in this case. That is, Venezuela did not attack the United States. It doesn't have the capacity to do it, and trying to do it would be complete madness and suicidal, nor was it preparing to attack the United States. The administration has never said that. So that defense doesn't work in terms of international law. The president then said that under Article 2 of the Constitution, as a commander-in-chief, he has the obligation to protect American military personnel. Fair enough, true enough. But there was no threat posed by Venezuela to American military personnel. It was us that positioned the equivalent of an armada of Venezuela's coast and blockaded the exit and entry of tankers, which, as you know, is generally done during times of war or is considered an act of war. So the idea that there was some imminent threat to the United States that required the military intervention into the country of Venezuela and the decapitation of its government by removing its president and bringing back to the United States simply doesn't work. Now, on Waltz's other point, the idea that somehow, and this is what he's suggesting, that Venezuela is part of a larger problem because it's controlled by, in effect, Iran and Hezbollah, and that means that they will have their hands on what are, correctly stated, the world's biggest proven reserves. Venezuela has about 20%. That's completely absurd. There's no evidence whatsoever that Tehran or Hezbollah, the Lebanese group, a Shia group, runs Venezuela, let alone even that it tells Maduro what to do on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know where this is coming from, but you have to make the threat sound ominous enough to justify it.
And what about the claim that some are making that, well, when the for example, the 1973 War Powers Act says that the president, the commander-in-chief, cannot take action unless he either has statutory authorization from Congress first or that we've been attacked. And they're saying, well, actually, it turns out we have, because the drugs that have been coming out of Venezuela have been killing Americans. Ergo, we've been attacked. So that is our justification. How does that stand up in court?
Right. So I've just been looking over a 72-page report put out by the DEA on drugs coming into the United States. If you look at the section on fentanyl, there's a long section. Many countries are mentioned. Which countries are not mentioned? Not a mention of Venezuela. If you look at the part on cocaine, which is in the U.S. Attorney's indictment, right? It says most of the cocaine that comes into the United States comes from Colombia via Mexico. So the idea that Venezuela is a major, excuse me one second, let me just silence my phone. My kids are texting. Okay, got it. So the idea that Venezuela is the source of a deluge of drugs coming to the United States, especially fentanyl and cocaine, there's no basis for that. And what's worse, the government's own documents and organizations put a lie to that assertion, which is extraordinary. However, and I just want to say this, there's a poll out now that shows that 70% of the Republicans approve of the president's actions. The vast majority of Americans do not. That's a separate story. And also, to give you a personal story, I was on BBC the other day debating a person. It was yesterday, and he was some former Fox News individual. And he gave essentially the defense that Waltz gave. So we ought not to think that this move that is so audacious and outrageous doesn't have purchase in the country. There are some people within the MAGA movement, or former, who have come out and criticized it, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Thomas Massey. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, they are in the minority.
Yeah, without question, they are. Though we're trying to increase that minority and trying to build up some speed, just because things, just looking at things as they actually are on the ground. And as you said, even our own reports completely contradict these audacious claims that are being made both by the president and many of his senior leaders. That has not stopped some of the others from being extremely pro-Trump and then to the point of being cheerleader to defend what he's done. And I want to show you a couple of them here, because this is concerning to me about what may come next. The subtitle of your article was that he's not thinking about what's coming next. And part of what concerns me is what may be coming next. And I want to look first at General Keane, because he's talking here about what the new president, or at least the new leader, Rodriguez, is going to have to do in order to avoid having another attack.
Remains to be seen whether she is going to bend to our will or not. If she doesn't bend to our will, then I think we're going to have to force the situation. We have enormous leverage given the success of the operation.
When you say force the situation, you mean force elections?
Force her, threaten her, and remove her if necessary.
Yeah. I mean, that is extraordinary. Why, upon what basis can we rationally claim? And I'm obviously, you know where I'm at on this, but so let me ask you from a professorial perspective, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I've overlooked something. Is there any basis in either international law or American law that would validate that claim should the government listen to him and do exactly what he says for someone who doesn't, quote, bend the knee to what President Trump says?
You're not missing anything, and I see eye to eye with you. Here is the problem, right? The fact that Maduro has not done well by Venezuelans, politically or militarily, economically. That is, politically, he runs a non-democratic system, and economically, the country under his watch has suffered grievously for a lot of complicated reasons. But that's irrelevant, because sovereignty is not tied to the character of a government. So, for example, North Korea is a dictatorial state that doesn't do well by its people, but that doesn't give other countries a license to swoop in there and grab Kim Jong-un. And as for democratic legitimacy in elections, some of the countries that we are closest to have at least a spotty record. Look at the Gulf states and look at the regime that Abdel Fattah el-Sisi runs in Egypt. And then there are examples from Central America. So to point out that, oh, this is a government that really hasn't done well by its people, and therefore we are legitimate in swooping in and grabbing its leader, that doesn't really work well. One other thing, Danny, he said, Waltz said, this is our sphere, and we kind of do what we want here, right? Strangely enough, that argument, when applied to Russia, is dismissed out of hand. Oh, well, Russia's not entitled to a sphere of influence. Right. China's not entitled to a sphere of influence.
Oh, yeah.
But I believe we are entitled to a sphere of influence. So this goes back to a problem that's not just a Republican problem. It's also been part of the liberal interventionists in the Democratic Party, this notion of the indispensable nation, right? So if you want to make the case that this is a nation of laws and we set an example by obeying norms and what have you, and we are the kind of guardian of those norms, you can't decide sometimes you're going to obey those norms and sometimes you're not, or some countries will be allowed to obey those norms and other countries, some countries will be required to obey those norms and others will not be. So no, I do agree with you. I don't see any basis for
Well,
this
so
being
now let me ask
what's
you,
more, yeah.
what may be some of the consequences of holding this position? Because we can sit here just on this show and say, well, it's obvious, double standards. We're telling everybody in the world, stay out of my hemisphere unless I give you express authorization, and we'll conquer you if you don't. But then at the same time, we tell Russia, yeah, but we'll be moving people all up on your border. We'll support Ukraine trying to kill your guys in their war. And then over here in Asia, we're going to have bases everywhere. We're going to have AUKUS. All of it's focused on China. We're going to have bases, in Japan and Guam and ad infinitum. And all that's fine. So not only do they not have a sphere of influence in their region, we can have military bases dotting all over the place and military activities here. That's fine, but you can't even have business interests here in one country in our hemisphere. How does that work?
There is a famous passage in Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War, where someone who's an aggressive proponent of the war says, look here, this is how things work. The strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. In other words, we have the power to do things that other countries cannot. The question is whether that power entitles us to do things against norms and rules which we ordinarily say we believe in. So if we do this again in Venezuela, and by the way, the president has said that if Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, he keeps saying that she's been sworn in. She hasn't been. She's the interim president. The government still refers to Maduro as the president. But the government's position, our government's position, is if she doesn't do what we want, and the guy in the clip said the same thing, that there could be another strike, that we have to threaten her. It's really quite extraordinary. And actually threaten her to do what? Trump says, well, we're now in charge of Venezuela. Now, let's think about this for a moment. This is a country of 30 million people. In land area, it's twice the size of Germany. How precisely are we going to be in charge of it? How are we going to run it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and we have a total of it's reported somewhere between 18 and 20,000 troops in total, air, ground, and sea in the region that were in part of this deal, and all focused in order to have one snatch and grab to get in and out in an hour and a half and be done with it. That's not a fraction of the force you would need to actually make good on what General Keane was saying there. He, above all people, should know that. One wonders if they're just trying to say, okay, you see what we've done here, we can do more. Don't test us, just do what we say. Now, it's one thing if it's Jack Keane. It's another thing if it's a sitting U.S. senator, in this case, Tom Cotton.
When the president said the United States is going to be running Venezuela, it means that the new leaders of Venezuela need to meet our demands. Our demands are now what they were before yesterday, that we want them to stop the drug trafficking, we want them to stop the weapons trafficking, we want them to expel the Cubans and the Iranians and the Islamic radicals, and we want them to return to the civilized world and be a good neighbor that contributes to stability, order, and prosperity in our own backyard.
See, we just are asking them to do the right thing, Raj. All we're saying is do what we say, have no friends except for who we say, and kick everybody out we don't like. That's it. And then we won't have a problem, and then you'll have peace. What do you say to that?
But notice something very interesting, right? Cotton is kind of shifting the goalpost despite the heated rhetoric. He's saying the government has to do certain things, and presumably if it does that, then it's off the hook. But then you have Waltz and Trump suggesting, no, I mean, the president gets the final word, right? He has said repeatedly, we are going to run the country. Remember Corina Machado, the one who won the Nobel Prize, the main opposition leader in Colombia, who actually dedicated part of her Nobel Prize to President Trump and has been basically behind the scenes, not calling for overt military intervention in Venezuela, but coming just short of that.
Yeah.
Massive pressure, Maduro's got to go. Now he's saying, well, she can't run Venezuela because she doesn't have the legitimacy and the authority. So the question is not just do we have the forces to go in and take down the government? Let's assume we did that, God forbid. What then happens? Are we going to stand up a state apparatus to run a country of this size and complexity? And what if there's resistance? Now, here's an interesting thing, right? Let's assume that nobody knows what the depth of support for Maduro is, but let's assume that 50% of Venezuelans, 60% of Venezuelans do not like him. But that 60% may not like the fact that a foreign invader is coming, dismantling the government, and saying, we will now take control not only of your entire country, but your most important asset, your military resources. I said the other day on the BBC, think about 20 years from now, there's a administration in Washington that neither you nor I like. And some third party comes in and intervenes and says, we're going to topple this government and we're going to run the United States. And by the way, we're going to take control of Silicon Valley. Now, I don't think you and I would really like that to happen, no matter what we felt about the government, right? So to say that Maduro is unpopular, or his government is unpopular, begs the whole question of what will be the reaction if we intervene. And I say this because, as you well know, our track record when it comes to regime change and nation building is really bad. It's something that we really are terrible at. So do we
Well, interesting you mentioned that, Raj, because one of the things President Trump said, he was asked a question in the press conference on January 3rd in the aftermath of all this, and was asked that question, almost verbatim what you said there. We don't have a good track record when we're doing regime change and whatever. He interrupted the question. He said, yeah, that's them. That's other people, not me. I only have success. All my track records are really good and perfect, to use one of his favorite words there. So that won't happen here because I said it, it's going to happen. And let's hear what he has to say, what he means when he's saying happens, because when that was Tom Cotton talking about us running it, here's what President Trump said about who's going to run it.
Are you saying that Secretary Hegseth and Rubio are going to be running Venezuela, and will you be sending in U.S. military troops to provide?
Team that's working with the people of Venezuela to make sure that we have Venezuela right. Because for us to just leave, who's going to take over? I mean, there is nobody to take over. You have a vice president who's been appointed by Maduro, and right now she's the vice president, and she's, I guess, the president. She was sworn in as president just a little while ago. She had a long conversation with Marco, and she said, we'll do whatever you need. I think she was quite gracious, but she really doesn't have a choice. We're going to have this done right. We're not going to just do this with Maduro, then leave like everybody else, leave and say, let it go to hell.
So, I mean, you've asked the question once. I guess I'm going to ask it again. What do you mean by do it right? What is right? What does that look like?
Correct. So the president said, we can't just leave because then who will run the country? That suggests that we will be there running the country. We'll work with the people of Venezuela. What does that mean exactly? The people of Venezuela are 30 million people, okay? Work with them meaning what? What if some segment of them does not want us there? But even if we overcome that resistance, running a government means essentially standing up a bureaucracy, maybe composed of Venezuelans and so on. You're essentially taking charge of a country as if it were a bankrupt company and trying to turn it around. That's hard enough to do. Remember the last time we did this in Libya? Said Muammar Gaddafi is a terrible guy. And we knocked off the regime. A civil war began. And Libya has since then had at least two governments. It's crawling with warlords and drug traders. And many of the immigrants that are crossing the Mediterranean Sea fleeing for their lives, that have got right-wing parties in Europe excited, are doing that to escape Libya, or others come to Libya because it's an escape route. And there's Iraq to point to. There's Afghanistan to point to. So
yes, I have personal experience in both of those. Trying to see it, it's terrible.
Trump will say, that's them. I will pull off the greatest regime change in the history of mankind. That's the way he says it. But that's really a kind of dangerous thing, because the administration appears to know, from my reading of things, very little about Venezuela. He said again that Rodriguez was sworn in. Now, maybe since he said it, that's happened. That hasn't happened to my knowledge. But when he said it, it had not happened.
So, and I'm wondering if that's kind of part of what you're getting at here, because in the subhead of your article, you say he has no clue what's coming next, and I suspect that's part of what you're talking about. But let's look at it. If everything in this military operation went according to plan, just insanely effective, and I get the idea that he thinks that because he gave the order and it went flawless, everything else is going to go flawless too. And I know he's thought through many of the things you've talked about here. But you mentioned a second ago, what if everybody, let's say that only 40% of the people actually supported Maduro, so 60% didn't. But now then you're coming in there, and what if even if the whole other 60% was willing to support whatever the president brought in, if some percentage of that 40% doesn't, and we actually have protests, we have violence going on, what is that going to mean? And you mentioned in this article, one of the things that you're concerned about is that the analogies for Iran, because we've kind of said some of the same things about Iran here in just the last week or so, and we are seeing some protests inside the country. And Trump has outright said we're going to go in militarily if they keep killing protesters. Do you see any correlation between these two?
Absolutely. And you don't have to take my word for it. The president has said again, I believe today, he's warned the Iranian government that if they keep killing people, then they will have hell to pay. I'm paraphrasing here. Right now, I'm not sure exactly what that means. And Iran is a much bigger country and militarily more powerful, but there's a serious problem there. In about 80% of Iran's provinces, the uprising has spread. And I'm no Iran expert, but from what I can tell, it's some mix of the dislike for the government, but also because there's a serious economic crisis. Now, if the uprising continues, that government is not going to go quietly, and there will be people who die. So what will be our next step? So are we going to run Venezuela, probably do another military operation there, perhaps attack Colombia, which the president has not ruled out? He's indirectly mentioned Mexico, and now also Iran. So call me limited in my imagination, but I have a hard time figuring out exactly what this means. You're a former military officer. There's an old saying, don't take the first step unless you've thought through at least the second step.
Well, so, it was more like fourth or fifth step in my view.
No, exactly. Yeah. So the military part has done well, and that has given Trump the confidence to believe that the rest follows. So we knocked over Saddam Hussein very quickly. We knocked over the Taliban very quickly. We knocked over Gaddafi very quickly. No one denies that the United States has the military muscle to knock over any government. The question is, what comes next? And are you prepared for the chaos that might ensue? And in order to tamp down the chaos, are you prepared to, in effect, militarily babysit that country for many, many years until your welcome wears out and you kind of face some kind of an insurgency? Because let's not forget one other thing. It's important to remember that Spain colonized Venezuela for 300 years, and the War of Independence lasted about 13 years, from 1810 to 1823. So this is a country that has experienced colonialism. It's shown that it can fight back. And I think that we have to be mindful of that when we say, well, we are going to intervene and take over. There's another thing. Who are we to say we now own Venezuela's petroleum resources, and we are just going to allow American multinationals, by the way, who've been very skittish about what the president has said, to come in? We don't have the right. There's a piece in Bloomberg today that points to a further problem. Their estimate is that the petroleum infrastructure of Venezuela is so decrepit that at minimum, it will require $10 billion of investment
Yep.
each year for 10 years.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that as well. I actually, from a separate, not the Bloomberg, I saw a separate assessment that said 5 to 10 years of exceptional amounts of investment, and it'll be a long time before anybody gets a return on that. And my observation is that clock doesn't even start until there is stability inside of Venezuela, where you have agreement on the people in Venezuela and with the United States, so that these people, civilians, feel safe to come in and start doing this work. Otherwise, it just seems that there's a very little chance that this is going to happen.
By the way,
want to
just
ask
one
you
quick,
Sure.
one quick note. You know, there's another theory that we can entertain, and that is when they mean put pressure on the government, they may think pressure that is sufficient enough to send a signal to the disaffected part of the Venezuelan population that they should rise up and overthrow the government. But that is inciting a civil war. And if it's a civil war that gets really bloody, and now we've shown that if the regime falls, those leaders will have hell to pay. So they have every incentive to really fight for their lives. Are we going to walk into a civil war in Venezuela?
That's the question that doesn't seem to be answered, because again, it just all the evidence points to you have the cheerleaders like Lindsey Graham, former Attorney General Barr, John Bolton, Jack Keane, Tom Cotton. You know, so many are just cheerleading this on. Nobody is talking about realistically what comes next. Now, what they are talking about, I'd like to ask your opinion on this before we let you go. Is you know what? Hey, we've been looking at Cuba for a long time, and the Bay of Pigs, that didn't work out, and we tried to knock off the former dictator many times, never got him, and now then maybe we can finally kill Cuba. Here's what Lindsey Graham said about what he thinks is coming next.
The communist dictatorship in Cuba will soon come to an end. 30% of the oil to supply the Cuban economy comes from Venezuela. Again, we got some work to do in Venezuela, but we'll get there. They will be denied the oil. The new leadership coming through a free and fair election, hopefully will happen sooner rather than later, is going to reject communist Cuba. Communist Cuba is a dictatorship that's killed priests and nuns. They've sent tens of thousands of people to our country here illegally. People have fled Cuba looking for freedom. The communist dictatorship's days are numbered. There's no way that the communist dictatorship in Cuba survives after the takedown of Maduro.
Raj, help me out with something here, because I'm clearly missing something that's going on. We had a soundbite a couple of days ago from Victoria Coates, former national security, deputy national security advisor, just was on this screed about how much of a threat Cuba is to the United States, and now is our chance to finally get them. What is this obsession with Cuba, this tiny little country in the Caribbean that's a threat to no one because they can barely even keep the lights on and their people fed?
Exactly. Note that when Graham spoke of Cuba, by the way, he said, well, we'll get to Cuba, but we have some work to do in Venezuela. Well, I'll say, he didn't say anything about Cuba posing a mortal threat to the United States. He, in fact, said its economy is kind of on its knees, right? He talked about human rights. But here's the problem. If you make a list of countries that have severe human rights problems and dysfunctional governments, that list is very long. It includes some countries which we support and have for a very, very long time. Is the strategy now to go after countries based on how they treat their people? Now, you and I don't like governments that mistreat their people, but is it our business, and should it be part of our American strategy to rectify those things? At what cost to American troops? At what cost to American taxpayers? And for how long will these assignments last? And have we thought about the adverse consequences? And have we thought about whether we can manage them? And from what I'm hearing, they haven't. Here's another problem. I know we're running out of time. I'll just say this very quickly. our government now is over personalized and under institutionalized. By that I mean the president is so strong that there is no dissenting voice in the cabinet. Cabinet meetings happen, he's praised, someone praises him, the next person then praises him more and more and more. As a praise arms race. The Republican Party, I hate to say,
Well said.
has been reduced to a cult. Democrats are like deer
Can't
caught in
dispute that.
headlights. They don't know what to do. The courts they're not working well. So the separation of powers, which is one of the bases of our Constitution, it is in a state of real decay. And so you have a president who's very mercurial, who believes that anything he can do will be a rapid success, but with no one to stand up and say, Mr. President, I think that's a really bad idea, and could I explain to you why? Because then you will not be in that administration. You'll be fired.
Yeah. We've seen that. There's no question about that. And then there's almost nobody wants to even find out. So that, as you said, it's a personality of cult. I mean, it's really no more accurate way to put it. We see it on display all the time. Last thing I want to ask you about is more on the moral and ethical plane, because I mean, you can talk about policies and you can talk about balance of power and who has the power to force a compulsion on somebody else, et cetera. But one of the things that troubles me is, since this administration has come in, especially whether it's with these, well, you can go back to the first Trump administration when it was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani from Iran. It was some assassinations, some people we did in Baghdad, actually this year. I think it was this year. Now these boats, and I think it's like 115 people have been killed, and it seems very thin, paper thin, maybe even spurious of the claim that, these drugs are coming to America when they literally couldn't even physically get to America. But we've done this anyway and claimed that. And then now 115 people are killed. And as you said, now the total death toll could be up somewhere around 80 that we've done here. And there doesn't seem to be the slightest concern on anyone. And I know you've been rather outspoken on some of the same kind of things in the Gaza situation, where we provided all this ammunition, and there's been almost no concern at all about the people, the innocent people, the tens of thousands who have been killed in the process. Are you concerned that the morality of this is also getting lost, and we just either don't care or cheer on when other people die as a result of our policies?
Yes, you and I have talked about this offline many, many times. I care for the same reasons you care. But there's also another question, right? If you do this kind of thing and say others can pay any price for the dreams that we have for the kind of countries they should live in, you are kind of setting yourself up to be all-knowing and all-seeing. And pride, as the Bible says, comes before the fall. So that is a dangerous thing. The other dangerous thing is that kind of thing can have a corrosive effect even in our own public morality, right? Because we've essentially said loss of life is appropriate just because we have a good idea underlying it. And that is the kind of thing that is not a good sort of narrative to course through American society. So I'm concerned about it on the external side. I'm concerned about it on the internal side.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out. My hope is that a lot of the stuff that President Trump hasn't been paying attention to, whether it's going after Greenland, we didn't even talk about that, or Colombia, or Mexico, or Cuba, or any number of other places that may pop up later.
That one's still on the books, I think.
It is. And we're 1 year almost into a 4-year term, assuming that President Trump's health stands out and he serves the whole term here. So we've got a lot of difficulties to go. One of the reasons why we think it's so important to point these things out here and hope that the President Trump either figures it out on his own or somebody tells him and he doesn't find out the hard way that all these hard questions that you said in this article here weren't considered. And he said, oh, wait, there's somebody tells him, wait, we can't go in and attack Colombia. That would be too much. And we can't go in and attack Iran at the same time. And all right, well, you know what? He's really famous for this, just going and doing something different. As long as it doesn't result in killing anybody or getting any of our troops killed, I'm all for it. And we'll just have to wait and see how it works out, I guess. But in any case, thank you for coming on today. And I appreciate you sharing your insights on this article. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Danny. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for you guys coming on too. We will continue to stay on top of this whole situation here. We got some great folks coming tomorrow. We got Douglas McGregor coming back, and I promise you don't want to miss what he has to say. He and I have been communicating the last couple of days, and he has a lot of interesting things to say that I promise you you're not going to want to miss. I think we have that at 11 a.m. tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. On Tuesday, Colonel Doug McGregor will be here, and we will see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You know we don't have sponsors because we hate to hit you over the head with ads. I don't like them. So show a little love back. Subscribe, like, and send this to somebody you care about.